Well, I said I would demonstrate a looser outlined poinsettia that I didn't overdo, and I will try to do that because my tendency is actually to sort of overdo and work it too much. This is a 1/2 inch round that I'm using. You could use the square. All I'm doing is I think I have a little better control with the round, but you can use a square, whatever your biggest one is, because we're just wetting the paper. And we're going to want to wet everything. The only thing I'm not going to wet on this one is this little middle section, because I want some of the white to show through there. So I'm actually not going to wet that little middle section, but I'm wetting all the leaves and everything else. You can wet the whole thing like I did on the last one, or you can do what I'm doing. It's up to you. This is still going to be a loose one. So you notice I'm not wetting just the petals. I'm kind of going beyond, because I am going to let those colors flow out. I'm going to go over everything again with my brush, make sure everything's evenly wet. Okay, I'm going to dip into that crimson, and I will add a little bit of new gamboge, because I don't think that's a very bright red. It's more of a rosy red, and poinsettias tend to be that nice bright color, so that new gamboge is going to make that color for us. And we're going to start putting it in here while it's still wet. The babies up front aren't going to be as dark. And let's put a little more orange in this one. See here, I think that's, well, it was going to be green, but it's not now. Okay, I'm just doing this fairly quickly. That's a leaf, so that's going to be green. Oops. Yeah, no, that's okay, gotcha. That's the leaf, that's the leaf, that's the leaf. The others are red. I'm going to clean my brush and grab a little lemon yellow to add some variety to this color in here. Lemon yellow displaces the red, and so it just adds a little bit of color variety. And we'll do some of these light ones up front. See, a couple of them are going to be this one. Let's say this one right here. He's going to actually be a real leaf. So you can also add other colors at this point if you want to add a little purple to the base, just to give it a little variety. Maybe that back leaf is a little darker, and so he's got a little bit of purple mixed in with him right there. This is still wet. Still very, very wet. I'm going to pretend there's another one over here, so that's why I'm doing that. And if I spritz with my sprayer, it will move around even a little bit more. I want that to look like it was on purpose running, because I really do want this to run into the background. Okay. A little pure color in a couple of spots that are still wet. This has to all be done while it's wet if you're going for this loose look. It has to be done while it's wet. I'm going to mix a little bit of new gamboge and yellow for a couple of these spots. just to sort of help those leaves separate from each other a little bit. And then we can take a smaller brush. I don't know what number this is, but I think it's a 5. Do you see that? And I will go into some ultramarine to give a little shadows while it's still wet. This has to be done fast while it's wet. So I know I'm working fast, but you can pause your video. And sometimes I recommend viewing it once and then pausing the video, because that way you kind of know what's coming. This is the shadow. Okay. This is starting to dry on me, so I'm going to have to quit doing anything, or it's not going to be a loose one anymore. It's going to be a tight one. I will do my green, and I should have had this good and wet beforehand, but I didn't. So we're going to dip into both greens, actually, a little bit of both. Those edges are somewhat dry on my red, which is good, because then my green won't run into it too much. I don't care if it runs over here, because we're going to pretend that there was a little leaf over there anyway, right? It's okay if it's mixing with the red, because that's just going to make it a darker leaf, and we're totally fine with that. Okay, do this last leaf down here, which actually dried on me. So just to make it look like the rest of the paper, I might wet the edges a little bit so that it will bleed a little bit like the rest of the picture. This is just an easier way without having to go into great amounts of detail. Let's see, those are just the stems where these little guys attach. And actually it looks like there is a leaf back here, so I'm going to paint that in, because that's part of this leaf right there. I'm going to put a little color on him because it was still wet, so I know that color's going to creep out to the end of the card. Okay. Now we'll put a little bit of blue on our leaves just to add a little shadow color where it's closest to the poinsettias. If your paper is somewhat dry, it won't bleed into your poinsettias. Now, the leaves on the poinsettias are kind of the opposite of the poinsettias in that the actual flowers tend to have darker lines in the middle for their what we would call the veins, okay? But the leaves are kind of opposite, because the leaves tend to have white veins, depending on the type of poinsettia, but that's at least what I've observed. I'm darkening that, just adding a little purple to the shadow part of it. If you have something that you can move water away, I like some of these things called nibs. No, that's not a nib. Where's the nib? It's right next to it. These things are called nibs. They even have them at Walmart. It's just a rubber nib. And this one is a little point. When your paper reaches a certain dryness, you can move paint off with that. See that? It's lifting it off. Now this won't work once it gets past a certain point, and it won't work before a certain point. See, that was too wet there, but at the end here it's doing it. So sometimes you have to just wait a few minutes and let it get to the point where it will lift off paint. I'm dabbing it. Every time I do this, I dab my brush. And you can do this later on after it's dry with a brush, and I'll show you that as well, maybe on one of these, but I wanted to show the different methods of creating line. I'm taking back my smaller round brush. It's not tiny, it's not big. I think it's number 5, but somebody was telling me that they seem to be numbered different in their sets, so it doesn't do a lot of good to tell you I'm using number 5 or whatever if you don't have the same color numbers in your set. So I kind of like the fact that these are lighter up front, so I really don't want to darken those much. Maybe just add a hair of color to it. And this little guy was a green leaf, but he was a baby. I want to put a little green in these because they're babies too. And they're probably just starting to turn red. There's a little too much paint there, so I'm going to soak it up with my brush that I dried. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow right there. And then we're going to put a little bit of green into this leaf right at the base. And a little bit of green into that one because he's starting to turn, but he's not all turned yet. And maybe a little red into this one because he just started turning. That was too wet. If it's too wet, it's going to wind up flowing into the flower next to it, which could actually wind up looking cool, but just in case that's not what you want. Okay, we're going to leave that alone and say that that's a really loose one. We'll come back in just a minute and do the little dots in the middle, and then it'll be done. I'm going to blow dry it, so let me mute. Because we outlined this with a permanent marker at the beginning, we have this really neat loose effect, but you can still tell what he is. That is way too thick of a marker for that. I'm going to grab a tiny little pointiest paintbrush that I have and just add a few little lines into some of the ones that don't have lines. I didn't draw all of the lines with my marker because when the leaves are younger, you can't see the lines very well. When they're older, they become more darker and more evident. So that's why I wanted to add the lines with watercolor versus drawing them with that dark pen on some of the younger leaves. Okay, now I was going to show you how to remove, if you wanted the green veins in your leaves, you can remove them after it's dry by wetting a line down the middle. Now I scrubbed that with that little nib earlier, so it's really not cooperating too well because I already scrubbed it with a nib. So I'll just do that and let it dry for a minute, and then I'll show you afterwards. But On this one over here, we should still be able to do it. You're just removing some color with your, oops, a little drop tried to go down on there. With your brush. You've got your finest little brush. And you're removing a little bit of color for his stems, or what do they call these? Veins. There we go. Notice you can't really tell I did anything until I use the paper towel. And I don't like the way that turned out right there, so I'm just going to add a little paint so that you can't really see what I did with that nib. It hadn't reached the right point of dryness, and so I don't like the way that looked. So we're going to come with a little bit of black and purple and just do these little balls in here. I don't know what color they're supposed to be. I think they're supposed to be like orange and green, so I guess we can do that. Or yellow and green. So put a little yellow and then add a little green. And the stems that came off of the flowers, you can see them right there. We'll just paint those. And that's done. So there is your second loose watercolor with an outline done with a permanent marker. It has to be permanent. I'll show you the one I used. It's actually a Sharpie. Permanent marker, ultra fine point. But if you have India ink, if you have anything that's permanent, and you can test it on a piece of paper like I did here before I started this. I tested it on a piece of paper, and then I put water over it just to make sure that it really was permanent, because sometimes they say that, but maybe they're not. And I did not want the water to wind up making a big mess. Well, thank you for painting along with me. I sure hope that you enjoyed it. And I do have another very detailed poinsettia that I may upload later. But in the meantime, please like and subscribe so you can see more of these videos.